I'm very much a newcomer to this field, and I just want to express what an honor it is to be on a panel with some of the giants in the field. It's humbling. I am a newcomer, but I've been doing this long enough to kind of remember back when I first started and how things have changed. When I first embarked on this body of research in graduate school, I started reading on the literature about bullying, and the impression I was getting pretty clearly was that the bulk of bullying was perpetrated by kids who were experiencing pretty substantial forms of maladjustment. Very troubled home lives, problematic psychological dispositions, and as someone who's interested in social networks, the impression I was getting was that these are kids who are not exactly going to be prom king and queen. They're not necessarily going to be, they don't fit the profile of high status kids. At the same time, I was also reading a lot of papers about chickens and how chickens establish pecking orders. There's a lot of complexity to it, and animal groups of all sorts use aggression to establish hierarchies. And so I was getting two very different impressions. One, on the one hand, we've got kids who are bullying other kids who I would think would be at the margins of a network. And then on the other hand, we have this idea, which I think is kind of compelling, that aggression at least has the potential to be useful for sorting out social hierarchies. And what I found in my research is that both things are true. I found a lot of evidence to suggest a very traditional perspective of maladjusted kids who are picking on those who are weaker than them. But I also found what I think is kind of a second pattern, which is what I'm going to focus on today, which is instrumental aggression. And, okay. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to play. Oh, thank you so much. So this actually, can you pause it first? So this is a school, and the kids represent dots. The dots represent kids, rather. This is a school, and what we've done is we've placed the nodes close to each other when they're friends. We've eliminated all the friendship ties in this network. But the kids, you can see they're organized. So that dense blob on the right, those are 8th graders who were kind of segregated in this high school. This is a high school that went 8 through 12. And the other grade clusters are somewhat less distinct. But these are kids, friendships are largely organized by grade in this school. And we place kids who are friends with each other closer together. And correspondingly, the kids who sort of are in the more dense cores are more popular. These are kids who would register as relatively high status. And so the lines you're going to see emerge are relationships, bullying relationships. And kids are going to start changing color from gray to red if they're sending bullying ties, and blue if they're receiving them, and purple if they're doing both. So hopefully this will work. But it's okay if it doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be doing what I thought it would. But what happens is, as you can see, this is kind of the end state. You see the formation of bullying ties not around the perimeter, as you might guess, especially if you were only looking at, I think, the earlier, very early work on bullying. What we see is actually a preponderance of ties originating within the core of these networks amongst the more popular kids. And I think this is evidence of an instrumental pattern of aggression. And I think further evidence of this comes from some of my other research with Susan Ennett. And we were interested in the role of status motivation. So if this is instrumental, we should expect kids who are really wanting to be popular, we should expect them to be more aggressive. And we found that. But we found another interesting dimension to that, where kids regardless of how much they care about popularity themselves, if they have friends who care about popularity, they're more likely to be aggressive. And so it's not necessarily the case that kids are, this is a big chess game and these are grandmasters battling it out. Kids, I think, get caught up in games that they don't fully understand. So this is not necessarily a whole lot of strategic action. I don't want to give that impression. Kids get caught up in status competitions. They may not even know fully what's going on. They may not have chosen to be in these games, but that's where they find themselves. Okay. Speaking of status, so in this case, these are data from dyads of kids, and this sort of plane reflects the rate of bullying between a pair of kids. The dyads are organized with a sender and a receiver, and so we're interested in whether the rate at which the sender in the pair bullies the receiver. And what you can see is that at the top right, the highest rates of the bullying are occurring when both partners in the pair are high status. Some literature would suggest that if the strong were picking on the weak, you would see that peak in the lower right corner. We do see that bullying is much more likely when the sender is higher status than the receiver. So in the extreme, you got this corner here, the lower right corner is higher than the upper left corner. But what we found in our data was that the absolute highest rates of aggression were occurring between relatively high status kids. And so that, to me, I think is again consistent with the idea of competition for status and the use of aggression to those ends. Okay, another aspect, I think, of instrumental aggression is the notion of social distance. And one of the striking things we found in our data was that aggression tends to stay within social categories. So on the left columns, we see race, and we only have enough data for African Americans and whites to be compared, but we see highest rates of aggression within race, not across race. And in fact, even controlling for a lot of other factors, we see a strong negative relationship, a very low likelihood of bullying to cross racial lines in our data. Likewise, with gender, we see high rates of aggression occurring between females, also between males, much more frequently than across gender lines. But as you'll see, if you do the math there, girls are picking on girls more often than boys are picking on boys, but boys pick on girls more often than girls pick on boys. And so while in our data we find roughly equivalent rates of aggressiveness among boys and girls are disproportionately being targeted. And a different data set from New York, we were able to collect some data on orientation, and we find actually, interestingly enough, a slightly different pattern, but very high rates of aggression among kids who identify as LGBTQ. So there's a lot of conflict in among the small number of kids in this school who identified in that way. You do see a traditional pattern of heterosexual students picking on LGBTQ kids at a relatively high rate as well. But a lot of bullying is within social demographics, at least in our data. And we can see this again in a different way, where we look at how far apart two kids are from each other in this friendship network. So sort of like the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon idea. And what we see is that the bullying rates drop dramatically as kids become farther apart socially. So what we're seeing, in other words, is a lot of aggression is occurring within the friendship group and even between friends. And there's interesting dynamics of friendships that we observe over time. If you track these things over time, there's some preliminary work that suggests that kids, when friends have an aggressive event, they cease to become friends at the next time point. But conversely, there's another sort of intriguing pattern where two kids, if they are not friends and they are aggressive, they actually have a greater likelihood of becoming friends at the next time point. So I think there's this sort of cycle of conflict that's going on, and allegiances are being formed and broken up. Okay, here's just another look that can show the relatively short social distances The red ties here are bullying relationships, and the gray ones are friendships. And so again, a lot of what you're seeing here, I think I can zoom in, are ties that are very close. A lot of these red ties are not stretching across the network. Not all of them, but many of them are at relatively short distances. A lot of this is going on, again, within friendship groups. This is another same basic idea, but this is cyberbullying. A lot of people, there's some thought that cyberbullying might exhibit different patterns. We're finding roughly the same patterns. It's less common than other forms of bullying in our data, but it looks roughly the same. Relatively high status kids targeting each other. Okay, and for the last, what I'll sort of conclude on are what the role status plays in the outcomes of bullying. We looked at, in a recent paper, we looked at 5 different outcomes of victimization: anger, anxiety, depression, attachment to school, and centrality in the network, or what we're calling status. And what we found was that the victims who were high status had a more adverse reaction to aggression. And that sounds a little surprising, and I think there's some explanations that will make sense to that. So this is the effect. On the bottom is victimization, and in the dark black line reflects one of the highest, 98th percentile status kids. So when those kids are victimized, their anger escalates much more dramatically than lower status kids. And we see the same pattern with anxiety, and again, the same pattern with depression. And we see the reverse with centrality. So the higher status kids drop in status much more significantly. And this is not exclusively due to a ceiling effect where they have no higher decline, they can only drop. When we actually just look at the middle 50%, we see the same pattern. So it's not driven by the ceilings or floors here. So these consequences are magnified for higher status kids, and I think what's going on here is that the kids who fit this sort of traditional profile of a victim of bullying, kids who are physically underdeveloped, who may have unorthodox expressions of gender or sexual orientation, kids who may not look right, whatever, those are kids who they've often been harassed since elementary school. And our data here are largely from high school. And so by the time they get to high school, a given event of bullying is not necessarily going to radically transform their sense of self. Whereas a kid who may have struggled mightily to reach the social position, a lofty social position, might experience a little more distress. They may feel like they have more to lose. On the flip side, the last thing I'll talk about here is whether it works. So if bullying or aggression is to be thought of as instrumental, it would be important to know whether it is actually effective for those reasons. And I've just shown you data that suggests that it has the effect of tearing down victims. So the victims lose status. But the other question is whether the perpetrators gain it. And in a paper where I used yearbook data actually to provide sort of additional measures of social status, and I followed kids over a period of 2 years, we found that aggressive behavior did predict a significant increase in their social status by the time they graduated from high school. But it really depended on who they were targeting. So they had to go after kids who were socially close, kids who are themselves aggressive, or kids who were high status themselves. So they had to pick the right targets to receive a social boost. But again, this is, I think, all sort of fits a picture of aggression as at least potentially useful for climbing social ladders. And so I want to close this talk with a couple of thoughts about what's going on here and maybe some hints at what we might do. The first thing that I want to talk about briefly is what I found. This is actually a national figure, but we find the same thing in our data. We see evidence of very poor friendship quality among high school students and adolescents generally. So nationally, 37. If you ask kids to name their 8 best friends, their closest friends, only 37% of those ties are going to be reciprocated. We see roughly equivalent rates of reciprocity in our data as well. We also see in another data set we collected, we were asking kids to name their 5 closest friends every 2 weeks, and we find tremendous amounts of turnover in a 2-week period. And so we're seeing evidence, we see kids who are naming kids and then they're saying they're not very close to these kids. So I think there's something going, this is a symptom of a problem. I think it's related to this process of competing for status. And I think if we thought about ways of helping kids develop stronger, more robust friendships, perhaps fewer of them, I think that might help build resilience. And the other thing, the other image below is I think intended to illustrate the ways in which schools unintentionally, but reinforce social hierarchies. We have things like prom royalty, where there are literal kings or princes and queens who are elevated. You see if you flip through a high school yearbook, you see best eyes, best physique. And maybe that's fine, maybe that's important. But it's at least something to think about because I think there is a dark side to this kind of reification of status hierarchies. So that's it. Thank you.